Well, I'm Russell Jaffe, an internist and biochemist, a certified clinical nutritionist, and a fellow of the National Academy for Clinical Biochemistry. I maintain a fellow status as an overseas fellow of the Royal Society of Medicine. I'm a fellow of the American Society for Clinical Pathology, the American College of Nutrition, the American College of Allergy, Asthma, and Immunology, and the American Medical Laboratory Immunologist. I am a fellow of the Health Studies Collegium and director and founder of both PERQUE and ELISA Act Biotechnologies. Well, we're looking at bone functions, and we are going to jump in as if we were looking inside the bone. That's the diagram we see on the bottom left. And there are certain cell types that we see on the right that are very important. For example, on the right, we see osteoblasts, osteocytes, and osteoclasts. Osteoblasts would be the bone formers. Osteocytes are the bones that maintain mature bone. There actually are cells that maintain mature bone. And the osteoclasts are the ones that resorb or recycle worn out bone so that the osteoblasts can place healthy new bone in place of it. And you see that cycle somewhat described on the lower left, where we see first the hyaline cartilage. This is a kind of approach model. There's a bone collar that you see on the left with primary ossification center. That is a place where the osteoblasts are going to be making new bone. And this is at the periosteum. This is at the edge of the bone. As we continue around to the third image, the one that's in the middle, we see blood vessels coming in to nourish the bone, but they're very tiny blood vessels. While they do bring nutrients in and waste out, there's a limited capacity to bring nutrients to the marrow and toxins from the marrow. As we come around, the fourth image shows the medullary cavity, the place where the business of making new cells is most active. And then on the far right, you see the articular cartilage, the shock absorber, water binding cartilage part, the spongy part, if you will, of our joints that coats the bone so that we have easy mobility of our joints and don't have bone on bone, or what's called osteoarthritis. And the points here on this slide are that bones do provide mechanical support, the first bullet in the upper left, but they also are sites for muscle insertion. So the way in which we move influences the bone, and as I'll say in a moment, actually influences bone health, because when we're more physically active, it stimulates, electrochemically stimulates new bone to form. The third bullet is that alkaline minerals are a reserve in the bone, but they deserve to be in the bone itself. Potassium, symbol K, calcium, symbol Ca, magnesium, symbol Mg, and other minerals are rich both in the bone matrix and in the periosteum, or in the high mineral density but still fluid interface between the bone and the outside world. And the fourth bullet, separate from the others, is that bone is piezoelectric. When we press on it, a tiny electrical current flows, and that tiny electrical current stimulates healthy resorption of used bone and stimulates healthy bone formation in the area that is so stimulated. So physical activity, stretching, weight bearing, walking is very important to stimulating healthy bone recycling because of this piezoelectric property that allows the mechanical support, the sites of muscle insertion, the reserves of minerals to all remain healthy and robust. Now, PERQUE BoneGuard Forte 20 builds bone. PERQUE BoneGuard Forte 20 has, since 1990, offered an unconditional money-back guarantee that anyone who follows the alkaline way, and that includes PERQUE BoneGuard Forte 20, when they measure their DEXA, when they measure their bone health by a DEXA score, we guarantee that they will grow new bone, not slow the loss of bone, but that they will grow new bone or money back. And we have done this as part of our testing of ourselves. We are confident that when people are following an alkaline way diet, alkaline way supplementation, first morning urine pH in the 6.5 to 7.5 range, and when that includes all of the bone building formula components, and there are 20 separate and independent essential nutrients for bone health, the lack of any one will impair bone recycling. So PERQUE Bone Guard Forte 20, that includes all 20 of the essential nutrients, is an important component of why we can build new bone when others do not. And we observe typically 2% to up to 12% new bone formation in just 2 years when people follow the alkaline way and include PERQUE Bone Guard Forte 20. On the right of this slide, you see that osteoblasts are bone formers and that there's a certain balance with the osteoclasts so that you have a balance of bone building and bone recycling. Bone resorbers, the osteoclasts, need a certain amount of calcium and magnesium and boron and germanium and zinc and manganese and chromium and vanadium and selenium and copper and silicon and iodine and iodide and strontium and D3 and K1 and K2 and biotin and ascorbates. All 20 of the ingredients brought together for the first time uniquely in PERQUE Bone Guard Forte 20. Here you see the product information sheet, which is easier to read on our website, and you're welcome to review it there at www.perque.com. But this is the information sheet about PERQUE Bone Guard Forte 20 Ultimate Bone Protection Plus, and you see on the bottom the changes that people observed over time, mostly in a positive and unprecedentedly and exceptionally positive bone growth. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, or 12% new bone growth, comparing an individual with themselves just by following the alkaline way, including PERQUE Bone Guard Forte 20. On this next slide, you see that 4 PERQUE Bone Guard tabsules deliver, and remember a tabsule is unique to PERQUE and contains all active components, all of which are fully disclosed all of the time on the label. But here you see in very small print, and again easier to read online at your leisure, all of the 20 components from minerals to vitamins to essential cofactors. And those of you who have supported us over the years know that PERQUE Bone Guard has been enhanced several times as the science progresses. So does PERQUE. As the evidence makes it appropriate, PERQUE improves upon any of our formulas. You also notice on the bottom of this page that the kinds of things that increase the need for PERQUE Bone Guard Forte 20 include sodium, higher protein above 60 grams in the diet that leads to net acid excess, caffeine, more than 1 cup a day of Java Joe or equivalent, and if people eat alcohol or tobacco. Any or all of these are consumers of the minerals and factors necessary for bone health, and the evidence suggests replenishing and enriching your intake if you have a diet that's higher in sodium, as most Westerners and processed food eaters do. If you have more than 60 grams of protein, which means more than 2 wet ounces of protein, caffeine-containing beverages, including the 5-hour drinks, which we do not recommend, and consumption of alcohol and tobacco, again, that we are not advocating, but do consume bone nutrients. And what about this remodeling cycle? Let's start in the upper right, where we look at bone resorption. When low calcium stores in the body, that is in the cells and in the blood, when there's a low calcium store in the body, the osteoclasts are stimulated to attach to bone. Second phase, number 2, the osteoclasts release enzymes that liberate calcium. Number 3, calcium enters the bloodstream, leaves the bone, and this is potentially weakening the bone. The weakened bone stimulates osteoblasts to repair the bone. And if the osteoblasts have all of the 20 nutrients they need, then they join with calcium to strengthen the bone. and that includes having enough calcium, magnesium, potassium, and all the minerals needed to have a healthy bone matrix. And then last, bone formation. The osteoblasts release back into the bloodstream. Bone is returned to a normal state. So this is the remodeling that happens to healthy people on a daily basis, stimulated by activity, stimulated by staying alkaline. Here we see another diagram about what have been called the bone health big three. And the big three for bone health are vitamin D3, calcium, and hormone or parathyroid hormone, also known as PTH. Parathyroid hormone or parathormone is known as PTH. And here we see the role of vitamin D in its native form, vitamin D3, that the cholecalciferol is hydroxylated in the liver. That's the first step. Becomes 25-hydroxy D3, then goes to the kidneys that then hydroxylate at the 1 position, leading to the active 1,25-dihydroxy cholecalciferol, the active D3, which then acts on the intestines in order to increase the blood calcium transit, or the uptake from the diet of calcium into the lymphatics and then into the bloodstream. And this can then go to the bone to facilitate or enable calcification, assuming you have healthy parathormone or parathyroid glands producing the PTH hormone. You have healthy liver and kidney producing the 1,25-dihydroxy-D, and you have healthy mineral levels or alkaline status in the cells so that the osteoblasts can work properly. And this diagram was taken from Harrison's Principle of Internal Medicine. On this, the conventional world and the integrative world all agree. Here we see the condition known as osteoporosis, or weak bone, and the role of the parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone does 3 or 4 things. First, it brings calcium into the blood so that osteoclasts release bone mineral. Then parathyroid hormone, or PTH, stimulates calcium absorption from the small intestine indirectly by stimulating the active form of vitamin D3 in the kidney. The 1,25-dihydroxy-D is facilitated by PTH, or parathyroid hormone. And vitamin D3 induces synthesis of calcium-binding protein in intestinal epithelial cells. It facilitates calcium absorption into blood. And fourth, it suppresses calcium loss in the urine. That is, it increases the reabsorption or the reuptake in the loop of Henle by minerals like calcium, so that less is lost into the urine. And on the left, we see a diagram that says low concentration of calcium in the blood causes release of parathyroid hormone, and that then either calls from the bone or decreases the kidney loss in the urine, or by enhanced absorption from the intestines, increases the concentration of calcium in the blood. This is what typically happens. This is what happened to my own mom, for example. That after your mid-30s, you begin to slowly lose bone mass. Women lose bone mass faster after menopause, but it happens to men too. And this, which comes from the Office of the Surgeon General, assumes that you will be eating some kind of modified standard American diet, which is an acid-forming diet, which is a diet that indeed causes progressive loss of minerals, first from the cells, then from the periosteum, and then eventually from the bone and large blood vessels as well. And I remember one time after not seeing my mom for about a year, going to give her a hug, and she fit into a place, either I had grown or she had shrunk, and I knew I hadn't grown. She fit into a different place in my body. And she looked at me and she said yes, that she knew that she was losing bone. And she was going to try and be more physically active, which was not, at that time in her life, her strong suit. She was physically active as a young person, but not as a senior. And she carried quite a bit of extra weight for much of her life. That was a real challenge for her. So she did suffer from bone loss over time. And while this is the typical curve, It is not the necessary curve. My dad, by contrast, for example, at the age of 90, and at 80 and 70 and 60 and 50, when we were able to measure him, had the same healthy bone activity and density, had the same healthy blood vessels and heart function at the age of 90 that he had at the age of 60 and 50. And this was after my dad suffered nutritional cirrhosis during the Depression in the 1930s, when many people had too little to eat. So it is not inevitable, but it is all too common that people, especially women, lose bone mass and height as they age. However, we can not just slow the loss, we can reverse the loss if it has taken place by following the alkaline way of living and including PERQUE Bone Guard Forte 20 as part of that. Now let's look at the typical life cycle and then how we would rethink that in terms of the physiology first approach. As we grow from adolescence to young adulthood, our bones get stronger. We reach a peak bone mass typically in our mid to late 20s and maintain that typically through our physically active years. Typically that means up until about the age of 50. Then for women in the perimenopausal or menopausal age range, and for men also, there is a loss of bone mineral, and that can become quite pronounced with long-lived individuals, leading to frailty in the elders. I emphasize that while this is the statistical average, it is not necessary, nor is it desirable, and we recommend the alkaline way to maintain that peak bone mass throughout the entire lifespan, as is predicted by physiology first approaches. Now, osteoporosis here is seen diagrammatically and visually well represented. On the left, you see normal bone. You notice that there are lots of little spaces, but there's also lots of good bone in those trabeculae, those areas that allow for a semi-permeable diffusion, but still with good, strong bone matrix, as you see the normal bone on the left. On the right, the demineralized osteoporotic bone, you see clearly the spaces are larger, and you can easily see that biomechanically that bone would be weaker. On the right, we see also a diagram or visualization of normal bone matrix and osteoporotic bone matrix. You see how many tiny intercalated interstices there are in the trabeculated bone in normal bone matrix, and you see the large gaping holes in the osteoporotic bone that decreases the health of the bone in many ways and makes it more porous. So osteoporosis has to do with porosity of the bone. We want bone to be very limited in its porosity. We don't want it to be too porous. We don't want it to be too weak because of being too porous. Here we see diagrams of the consequences of osteopenia, that is loss of bone matrix, and osteoporosis, the definition being a significant loss. So osteopenia is on the way to osteoporosis. And this can contribute to risk of vertebral fractures, hip fractures, and wrist fractures. Minor traumas can cause more damage when the bone is not being healthfully resorbed and recycled and renewed. Indeed, fracture is often the first sign of osteopenia and osteoporosis. Women lose about 20% of their bone mass 5 to 7 years after menopause, secondary to metabolic acidosis. I will say again, it's secondary to metabolic acidosis. And because it is a consequence of metabolic acidosis, it would not happen if people were not eating acid-forming diets. The standard American diet is sad in being metabolically acid-forming. It contributes acid on top of the metabolic processes of the cell that contribute net acid that needs to be buffered. So we need to take in buffering foods, alkaline-forming foods, the foods that we will talk about in a few minutes. Poor bone health is common and costly. Common and costly. Poor bone health is associated, as you see diagrammatically here from the Office of the Surgeon General, fractures from osteoporosis. 1.5 million people a year have fractures from osteoporosis. Almost all of those avoidable if they had healthier bone matrix and an alkaline way of living. 500,000 hospitalizations due to osteoporosis directly as a consequence of falls and other frailties. 800,000 trips to the emergency room, 2.6 million visits to doctors' offices, and 180,000 people placed in nursing homes each year because of loved ones wanting to make sure that the risk of a fall or fracture because of osteoporosis doesn't affect their loved ones. Indeed, 50% of Americans over 50 have weak bones or osteopenia and are at risk of osteoporosis due to their low bone mass. That's where we will be in 2020 if we keep going at the rate we are. On the right, you see that 1 in 2 women more than 50 has an osteoporosis-related fracture during her lifetime. I'm suggesting that essentially all of those are avoidable. Men have 26% greater death rate within a year after a hip fracture. That's even more than women in terms of the rate, the consequences of hip fracture on morbidity for men. Again, much of that avoidable if they were more physically active and alkaline in their lifestyle. 1 in 8 more than 50 years of age will suffer fractures related to osteoporosis. Good gosh. In regard to osteoporosis, typical bone mass loss with age means that the acid-forming diet, the standard American diet that contributes acid, that pulls minerals out of the bone, will typically cause about 0.7% of the bone to go away each year. In 10 years, that would be 7%. In 40 years, that would be 28%. So you can see you need to be a long-lived person before that frail activity problem really affects you, but it can start in your young adulthood. The points here are 2. First, there's a decrease in osteoblastic activity, and there's a decrease in growth factors in the bone matrix itself, associated with acidosis, metabolic acidosis, diet-induced acidosis. And usually it's about 8 months from resorption to matrix synthesis to new mineralization. So bone forms slowly. And because of that, we make measurements every couple of years because it takes about 8 months from the time the osteoclasts resorb the bone until you build a new matrix, a new collagen structural protein matrix, and then mineralize it in. That in healthy people takes about 8 months, and in less healthy people takes longer. So bone changes slowly, and the good news is it can rebuild even in the long life. Now, osteoporosis has a number of causes, and they come down to acids from diet and other acids from stress. You see here the kinds of preferences that too many people have for things that in small amounts would be okay, but in the amounts we take them are harmful because of their addition of acid to an already metabolically acid state for the cells, increasing the need for buffering minerals from the diet and from supplementation. And as we'll learn in a few minutes, we now know what to do about this. So osteoporosis has causes. The causes have to do with an imbalance between new bone made and old bone resorbed. Osteoporosis causes have to do with loss of bone mineral density. BMD is the abbreviation for bone mineral density. Fewer minerals than normal, meaning the low bone mineral density. A hormonal imbalance like adrenal estrogen in women and androgens in both women and men. So healthy estrogens make healthy bone, unhealthy estrogens the opposite. Healthy androgens in both men and women help make healthy bone, unhealthy androgens do not. Menopause means a lower estrogen level for most women rather than a shift. higher risk of bone loss with acidosis. So if you combine an acid-forming diet and the typical estrogens in the perimenopausal and menopausal period, you'll have accelerated bone loss. Inadequate calcium, vitamin D, and alkalinizing minerals can be reflected and assessed in the first AM urine pH, and we recommend that folks who want healthy bones throughout their whole lifespan would measure in the morning first AM urine pH, keeping it in the 6.5 to 7.5 range based on their diet, their supplements, their activity, and their attitudes. We would recommend that if you want osteoporosis, then you would lack weight-bearing exercise. If you want to avoid osteoporosis, you would have weight-bearing exercise. In osteopenia, as we indicated before, you show on the right the pre-osteoporosis with lowering of bone mineral density, that's in the middle, and osteonecrosis is chronic bone diseases like scoliosis, brittle bones, and spinal deformations, and that are fairly advanced forms of the osteoporotic and or bone disformation process. Now, there are diseases that cause or contribute to secondary osteoporosis. There are some genetic disorders that have a higher prevalence of sedentary lifestyle that is associated with accelerated osteoporosis. And you see Ehlers-Danlos and cystic fibrosis and glycogen storage diseases and Gaucher's disease and hemochromatosis and homocysteinuria and hypophosphatasia and idiopathic hypercalciuria. There are also hypogonadal states where the androgens are low, either because they're not being made or the wrong ones are being made. There are endocrine disorders, hormonal disorders that are associated with accelerated or more rapid osteoporosis. And there are gastrointestinal diseases, including, of course, gastrectomy, but also inflammatory bowel disease and malabsorption syndromes and celiac disease and primary biliary cirrhosis. And then there are hematologic disorders, including hemophilia, leukemias, and lymphomas, multiple myeloma, sickle cell disease, mastocytosis, surprisingly common and rarely diagnosed properly, and thalassemia. And among the rheumatic and other autoimmune diseases, ankylosing spondylitis, lupus erythematosus, rheumatoid arthritis, just to name a few, are associated with more osteoporosis. And there are the miscellaneous associations with alcoholism, amyloidosis, chronic metabolic acidosis, which I think is behind almost all of them, congestive heart failure, depression, emphysema, end-stage renal disease, epilepsy, idiopathic scoliosis, immobilization syndromes, multiple sclerosis, muscular dystrophy, post-transplant bone disease, and sarcoidosis. And of all of that, I would pay most attention to chronic metabolic acidosis and immobilization, so being physically active and being physically engaged is essential to maintaining and or to restoring a healthy bone activity. Osteoporosis has certain signs and symptoms that can range from back pain that is otherwise unexplainable to loss of height over time due to a stooped posture, to collapsed vertebrae, to fracture of the vertebrae, wrist, hip, and other bone. And this is diagrammatically reinforced on this slide. Here we see a kind of complicated slide. You're welcome to come back and review this if you wish. I'm really pointing out only one or two things to take away from all of this. And the first and important thing is that the bones and the body are connected. So on the top, we see a diagram of the brain, which contributes sympathetic neurotransmitters. That means the adrenalins and noradrenalins, but a balance of different activation neurochemicals. Anabolic drive comes from the parathormone activity. Mechanosensing influences these osteoblasts, and there are also nutrient signals like rank that either favor bone recycling or bone renewal. And we are beginning to learn many of the subtle and deep aspects of this, but what it comes down to is that healthy alkaline cells are energetic and have all of the communication molecules whose names you see in acronyms here, and that the bottom line is that if we're mentally and physically active, if we eat and supplement to keep our chemistry in a healthy balance, then we will be stimulating the formation of healthy new bone, we will be stimulating the formation of healthy new collagen and structural protein, we will be stimulating the recycling of older bone through the osteoclasts and system. Now there are things that we do need to be concerned about, sometimes even including our drinking water. Many areas of the country chlorinate their drinking water in order to sterilize it at the water treatment plant. This can cause chloramine molecules to form, that is chlorine and ammonia combining to form chloramine. Among other things, this removes manganese, and that disrupts the urea cycle, which is the detoxification cycle, because manganese is essential for converting ornithine to citrulline. Then vitamin D becomes deactivated, so you can't hydroxylate the 25-hydroxy-D to the 125-dihydroxy-D. So vitamin D is not sufficiently available, then calcium is not sufficiently available. So chloramine in drinking water should be filtered out by a charcoal filter. And remember to take more manganese or manganese-rich foods that include nuts and seeds and certain sprouts to have a healthy manganese level. The conventional treatment for osteoporosis includes certain medications, bisphosphonates, estrogen hormone therapy or estrogen replacement therapy, ERT, and then selective estrogen receptor modulators or SERMs that are just coming in to clinical use. We at this point have had enough experience that I do not recommend the bisphosphonates, nor do I recommend estrogen and hormone replacement therapy. I do recommend people be physically and mentally active. I do recommend an alkaline way of eating and supplementing. And you then will have a healthy balance of healthy estrogens and healthy androgens, that you will have a healthy balance of osteoblasts and osteoclasts. And yes, there are certain short periods of time or certain situations where selective estrogen receptor modulators are helpful for short periods of time, but be careful about using them for more than short periods of time if needed. Now, an interesting association exists between inflammation and osteoporosis. Inflammation really is repair deficit. This is one of our contributions. And repair deficit and osteoporosis go hand in glove, or bone in joint, as the case may be. So inflammation really is repair deficit. You can measure repair deficit inflammation using a high sensitivity CRP, HSCRP. We want the HSCRP level to be less than 0.5 so that bone mineral density will be optimized. If CRP levels are higher, that suggests systemic as well as local repair deficits. People with rheumatoid arthritis or other autoimmune conditions are more likely to develop osteoporosis, and the TNF, or tumor necrosis factor family molecule called RANKL, that's the abbreviation, rheumatoid arthritis, natural killer, etc. The TNF family molecule RANKL and its receptor RANK, which is the receptor for the activator of NF-kappa B for those aficionados on this webinar, leads to bone loss in rheumatoid arthritis. And the way in which inflammation mediates its activity is through pro-inflammatory cytokines, the third bullet, like interleukin-1, IL-1, and TNF-alpha, tumor necrosis factor alpha, implicated in regulation of osteoblasts and osteoclasts. And I'm old enough to remember when Tom Waldman was first identifying and characterizing IL-1, interleukin-1, and then its receptor, and IL-2, interleukin-2, and now there are hundreds, there may even be over 1,000 different communication molecules or cytokines that have been identified in different laboratories around the world. And there's an interesting link between the inflammatory mediator nitric oxide, or NO, and osteoporosis. So we want to have healthy nitric oxide response systems to modulate repair where needed and as needed. Homocysteine, or detoxification, is important in osteoporosis, and I put brackets around it to indicate concentration. So the level of homocysteine is particularly predictive. The higher the homocysteine, the more the risk of osteoporosis, because homocysteine interferes with collagen crosslinks, increasing the risk of osteoporotic fractures. Homocysteine causes reduction in bone blood flow and biomechanical loss, and homocysteine is associated with, or its elevation is associated with, low folatals that are linked to reduced bone mineral density in women, the so-called Hordaland homocysteine study, which is cited on the bottom of this slide. So homocysteine methylation and detoxification have important links to osteoporosis, and another aspect of the alkaline way for managing healthy detoxification by keeping homocysteine below 6 is illustrated. Further, oxidized cholesterol, or oxidation of essential fats, is associated with osteoporosis. High oxidized LDL cholesterol stimulates the immune system's production of rankle that stimulates bone loss, or stimulates bone osteoclastic activity. And oxidized cholesterol itself promotes bone loss. So we want to keep the oxidized fats undetectable. We do that with enough antioxidants, starting from calibrated ascorbate and including polyphenolics and others. We find that stress hormone balance is also related to osteoporosis, so we want to look at the cortisol to DHEA relationship. We can look at free cortisol to free DHEA in the saliva. That leads to an increase in inflammatory cytokines, that leads to an increase in blood loss. So the conventional literature is really quite supportive of the mechanism, and the alkaline way addresses these epigenetic or mitigatable the causes that are under your influence. Here we have a synthesis of acid-alkaline metabolism and its link to osteoporosis. Net acid excretion, NAE, is key to bone loss. You want to increase, you have an increase in calcium loss with high NAE. More acid in the urine means a lower pH below 6.5, indicating more loss of minerals that are induced by dietary protein, especially when you have more than 60 grams a day, as you would unless you're on a modified vegetarian or vegan diet, you would get more than 60 grams a day. Fruits and vegetables, lentils, pulses, legumes, beans have lots of buffering minerals, and they're highly recommended. We recommend using this pH strip that you see in the lower right to measure, and that it significantly correlates with the overnight net acid excretion, NAE. So first morning urine pH between 6.5 and 7.5 is recommended. Susan Brown and I published an article on this in actually a decade ago in the International Journal of Integrative Medicine, pointing out that epigenetics was very important, and there was lots we could do to maintain and sustain healthy bone activity. The alkaline way markers of health and risk are the following. They have to do with the degree of inflammation, which is repair deficit, and we want to measure HSCRP, and it should be less than 0.5. Detoxification and methylation, say homocysteine, should be less than 6 milligrams per deciliter. Oxidation and antioxidant status can be assessed by measuring oxidized HDL and LDL and 8-oxoguanine, and they should be not detectable. Stress hormone balance is addressable looking at the relationship between free cortisol and free DHEA at 4 different time points, either in the plasma or in the saliva. And then finally, the 5th component, the acid-alkaline metabolic status, measurable by first morning urine pH, 6.5 to 7.5, and the alkaline way helps restore, repair, and defend the body. So our goals for this webinar have been to understand more deeply inflammation, rethink it as repair deficit, show its links to the cause of osteoporosis, and to take a physiology-first approach to restore host homeostasis by a predictive test applied functionally and individually referencing healthy values. The alkaline way helps restore, repair, and defend the body, and part of this is a positive mineral balance for bone maintenance, restoration, and long-term health and vitality. So the innate immune system plays an important role here to protect, to recycle, to defend, and repair. There are interdependent health habits that are generally and specifically recommended, including a balance of rest and activity, of breathing and being, mindfulness, such as active meditation practices, weight-bearing exercise, active stretching, such as Traeger mentastics, or Pilates mat work, or the Feldenkrais system, and relaxation response, evoking salt and soda baths to help alkalinize, as well as to help with restorative sleep, so that in the morning we can be metabolically balanced and have a healthy 6.5 to 7.5 pH.